It always started with the creaking of the wooden floorboards, the faint scent of old candle wax, and the sound of shoes, heavy and slow, outside the door. You'd hear them long before you saw them, and by then, it was already too late to turn back. They called it the Red Room, but there was nothing red about it anymore. The curtains were stained, the color drained by soot and time. The bedding had been patched over so many times, it was more stitches than fabric. But it was yours. A corner of the world carved out in the back streets of town where no one asked too many questions. It was the kind of place where people whispered more than they spoke and looked away more than they stared. In the cold hush of medieval night, behind thick walls that muffled both laughter and weeping, your life unfolded in slow, heavy silence. You were not born for this. No one ever is. But life in the medieval world was rarely kind to women, especially to those without dowries or protection. Your mother once said beauty could be both a gift and a curse. You hadn't understood it then. You do now. It began with hunger. Your brother had left to fight in some war, your father died in one, and your mother couldn't stretch the bread any thinner. A local woman named Annis, wrapped in furs and speaking like a priest's widow, said she had work for you. Something clean, something that paid. She smiled too much. The first time you stepped inside the brothel, the warmth surprised you. It was cleaner than home. It smelled of lavender and something spiced. There was food, actual food, on the table, bread still warm, a slab of cheese, even a bowl of apples. It felt like stepping into another life. But by the end of that first night, after the fire had died and the last footsteps faded down the stairwell, something inside you had changed. No one warned you how it would feel to live a life where you were seen but never known. The men were strangers, but the routine became familiar. You learned to light candles just so, to wear certain colors on feast days, to know the difference between a knight and a merchant by the weight of their coin. You learned silence. You learned stillness. You learned how to protect the small, soft part of yourself that still remembered your mother's lullabies and the feel of morning dew in spring. Days were blurred and quiet, but nights were loud and strange. Sometimes there was singing, sometimes fighting. The madam, a woman named Magda, kept strict order. She had once been a lady-in-waiting, they said. She had manners like a noble and eyes like a hawk. She protected you, in her way, but protection came with rules. Smile. Don't speak unless asked. Never fall asleep before the guest leaves. And always wash with the mint basin before starting the next shift. That was how infections spread, and infections brought death. You watch girls come and go. Some arrived crying, others hard-eyed and silent. Most had stories that started the same. No food, no husband, no choice. One girl named Ellen had a laugh like silver bells and a mouth too quick for her own good. She lasted 6 months before a man in a fur cloak struck her across the face for speaking too sharply. She left the next morning with one eye swollen shut and never came back. You wondered what happened to her. You still do. But not all visitors were cruel. Some came just to talk. A baker's apprentice once paid for an hour just to hear you describe what trees looked like outside the city. A traveling monk slipped you a hymn he'd written, hidden under the cloth of his robes. He said he prayed for you. That was the only time you cried in front of someone. You learned to read people the way others read books. You noticed the way noblemen tugged at their sleeves when lying, or how a drunk soldier always spoke of his mother before passing out. You started to feel like you were seeing the world behind a veil no one else noticed. You weren't just a woman in a brothel. You were a watcher, a listener, a shadow in someone else's dream. But even in a place like this, things change. One evening, just after the church bells had rung for vespers, a new girl arrived. She was different. She carried herself like someone who'd never begged a day in her life. Her gown, though worn, had once been embroidered with real thread of gold. And her hands, clean, untouched by fieldwork or ash. She didn't speak much. Gave only her first name, Isolde. The other girls whispered. Some said she was a runaway noble. Others said she'd killed a man. You didn't know what to believe, but something about her unsettled you. Isolde didn't follow the rules. She didn't smile when spoken to. She didn't wait for Magda to assign her rooms. She wandered the corridors at night, barefoot, with a candle stub in hand. Once you caught her outside your door, just listening, not knocking. Her eyes were strange, sharp and cold. She spoke Latin in her sleep. Within a week of her arrival, one of the regular patrons, a merchant with ties to the town guard, vanished. No one said anything, but his cloak remained hanging near the hearth for days before Magda finally had it burned. Then another man, a scribe from the abbey, stopped coming. Then a young page who used to bring sweetmeats for the girls. Gone. Just gone. The others whispered more now. Some girls left. One simply ran into the street and never returned. And still Isolde remained, quiet as fog, her presence growing heavier with each passing night. You began to feel like the walls were shifting, like the very bones of the brothel were watching you back. There are sounds now, low, scraping ones, from the old servants' stairs no one used. Candles flickered in rooms that should have been empty. Once, you found a lock of hair, your own, tied with red thread under your mattress. You wanted to speak to Magda, but when you tried, she only shook her head. Don't ask questions, she said. Girls who ask don't last. Then, late one night, after a particularly long shift, you returned to your room to find her door ajar. A candle burned low inside, but you hadn't lit it. On your pillow sat a single object, an old brass key, worn and cold to the touch. Attached was a scrap of parchment with 2 words written in dark ink. Don't trust her. And you knew this was no longer about surviving the night. Something else had begun, something hidden beneath the brothel's floorboards and silence. And you were already in too deep. The footsteps returned, louder this time, slower, coming toward your door. And you weren't sure if it was her. You didn't breathe, not until the footsteps stopped just outside your door. Then you pressed your back against the wall, the brass key gripped tight in your hand, your fingers sweating around its cold edges. Whoever was outside didn't knock. They just stood there, long enough that the silence became unbearable, long enough that you began to wonder if you imagined the whole thing. Then, just as suddenly, the steps moved away. You heard them descending the stairs, slow, measured, and vanishing into the creaking rhythm of the brothel at night. You didn't sleep. Instead, you stayed curled in the corner of your bed, watching the flickering candle melt away into a stub. The parchment with its 2 haunting words lay on your lap, the edges crinkled from your trembling hands. You turned it over a dozen times, hoping to find more, a symbol, a signature, anything. But there was nothing. You thought of Isolde, of the way she never really blinked, of how her voice never quite matched her smile. You remembered how she had asked about your room once, what direction it faced if the floorboards creaked at night. She'd seemed curious, but not in a harmless way. You couldn't say why, but something about her questions had felt more like studying than conversation. And now someone else, or maybe her, was warning you, or threatening you. At first light, you slipped out of your room with the key tucked into your bodice and made your way down to the kitchens. Mornings were quiet. The night girls were asleep, and the day girls wouldn't arrive for another hour. You pretended to fetch water, but searched the walls instead. Old places like this always had hidden doors, old cellars, storage rooms sealed off from past lives. Maybe that was what the key was for. Maybe it opened more than just a lock. Magda was already downstairs, sitting at the long table with a pot of tea, flipping through her ledger with a look of concern. She didn't look up when you passed. But as you reached the stairs to return to your room, she spoke. Some things are better left shut, girl, she said quietly. You froze, your hand resting on the railing. Her eyes never met yours. She didn't look angry, just tired. You nodded once and went back to your room. The rest of the day passed like fog. You couldn't focus on the patrons. Their faces blurred together. The jokes, the smells, the clink of coins, they all felt distant. All you could think about was that key. You wanted to throw it away. You wanted to bury it and forget. But more than anything, you needed to know what had opened. That night, you waited. Waited until the brothel quieted, until the last drunk footsteps wandered out the front door and Magda latched it shut with her usual 3 clicks. You counted them from your room. 1, 2, 3. Then silence. You wrapped your shawl around your shoulders and crept into the hall, barefoot and slow. The key was cool against your chest. You didn't have a plan, just a feeling, like the key would lead you, if only you listened. Down the hall, past the servants' stairs, past the room that used to belong to Ellen. You paused there. Someone had moved into it since, but the air still smelled like her rose water. She used to sing while brushing her hair. That room had felt safe once. Now it just felt empty. Then, just beyond the last guest room, you saw it. A small wooden door, lower than the others, half hidden by a curtain. You'd passed it dozens of times and never thought twice. But tonight it pulled at you. You reached for the latch. Locked. You took a breath. Slid the key from your bodice. It fit the lock like it had been made for it. The click echoed too loudly in the silence. You stepped inside. The air was different, damp and cold. Stone walls. No windows. It was a stairwell spiraling down beneath the brothel, deeper than the cellar, deeper than the old wine room Magda kept locked. You held your candle high and began to descend. Your steps were quiet, your breath louder than your feet. At the bottom, there was another door. Iron this time. Thick. Rusted. It took both hands to push it open. And what you found was not what you expected. It wasn't a dungeon. Not a tomb. Not even a secret room. It was a chapel. A forgotten one, from the looks of it. Long abandoned, the altar cracked, the paintings faded with mildew. But someone had been here recently. Wax drippings still fresh. Footprints in the dust. A chair pulled close to the altar like someone had been praying or watching. And at the center of the altar, nestled between broken candlesticks, was something wrapped in cloth. You stepped closer and pulled back the folds. It was a book. Not just any book. The leather was stained black with time, and the cover bore a symbol you didn't recognize. You opened it, half expecting dust to fly into your face. But the pages were clean, written in ink darker than soot, in a language you didn't understand. Not entirely. Some of the words were in Latin. Others weren't. Some looked more like symbols than letters. But the images, that was what chilled you. Women, drawn in detail, surrounded by circles. Some asleep, some awake, their eyes wide with terror. In every image, a shadow loomed behind them. Always the same shape, always faceless. And in the margins, scribbled in the same ink, a phrase repeated again and again. She will rise again. You closed the book. Something rustled behind you. You turned, heart pounding, expecting to find Isolde or Magda, or maybe a rat. But there was nothing. Just the dark stairwell. But you knew. You knew someone had been watching. You grabbed the book and fled. Back up the stairs, through the narrow door, back into the brothel's corridor, where everything smelled like perfume and old linen again. You slammed the little door shut and locked it, heart pounding so loudly it drowned out every other sound. When you returned to your room, dawn was already peeking through the window. You placed the book under your bed and collapsed onto your sheets, unsure if you had uncovered something sacred or something meant to stay buried. You didn't sleep. You didn't even close your eyes. Because when you looked toward your door, you saw something new. A red thread tied to the handle and looped around the outside. Like someone had been trying to keep you in. And suddenly, the question wasn't just what did the book mean? Or who left the key? It was this. What if you were never meant to leave this place at all? The thread was thin, no thicker than a strand of hair, but it felt heavy, like it carried the weight of something older than the brothel itself. You stared at it from across the room, your breath tight, the silence stretching long enough that you could hear your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. Slowly, you got up, each creaking floorboard sounding far too loud in the early light. When you reached the door, you didn't touch the thread right away. You just looked at it. It was tied in a perfect loop around the handle, like a ribbon, but knotted in a way you didn't understand. There were no loose ends, just one unbroken circle. You traced it with your fingertip. It was cold, and then, without thinking, you pulled. It unraveled easily, falling in a soft coil to the floor. You stepped back, half expecting something to happen, a noise, a gust of air, anything. But the hallway outside was still. Too still, like the whole brothel was holding its breath. You glanced back at the bed, where the book lay hidden beneath the mattress. You hadn't touched it since returning. Part of you didn't want to, but another part, bigger, hungrier, needed answers. You crossed the room and pulled it out again. The leather still felt warm in your hands, like it had absorbed your fear during the night. You flipped through the pages, stopping at the image of the woman in the circle. Her eyes were wide, but not empty. They looked awake, aware, like she knew what was coming and had accepted it. There was something in her expression that felt too familiar. You closed the book again. Downstairs, voices had started to stir. Girls yawning, water being fetched, the usual rustle of life returning after a long night. You quickly wrapped the book in a scrap of cloth and tucked it into a loose panel in the floorboards beneath your bed, covering it with an old shawl. You needed time to think, to act like nothing had changed. But things had changed. When you stepped into the hallway, the other girls barely looked at you. That wasn't new. But this morning, they looked past you, like they were trying not to see you. One girl, May, usually cheerful even in her tiredness, gave you a glance that felt like a warning. You found her later by the washtub, wringing out sheets and muttering a song under her breath. "May," you said softly. She didn't answer. You waited until she turned. "Did you see anything last night?" Her hand slowed. "No, but—" I said no, she snapped, louder than expected. Then her voice softened, and she leaned in, eyes darting around to make sure no one else was near. Some things are older than the stones in this place. You start poking at them, they start poking back. "What is this place?" you whispered. May shook her head. "Not everything needs a name. Just stay quiet, keep your head down, and don't go near the chapel again." Your blood ran cold. You hadn't told anyone where you'd gone. "Ow! I didn't need to know," she said. "But others do. They always know." She went back to scrubbing. You stood there, stunned. Suddenly, everything around you, the walls, the stairs, the smell of wax and wine, felt unfamiliar, like you'd slipped into another world and hadn't noticed. That night, the routine returned. Or tried to. You painted your lips with the tint Magda provided, wore the blue dress because the guests liked that color, and lit the candles in your room the way you always had. But nothing felt normal. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every smile from a guest felt forced. You kept glancing at the floorboards, thinking about the book, the drawings, the thread. Then, just past midnight, Isolde came to your room. She didn't knock. She just appeared in the doorway, like a shadow, stepping into light. "You look tired," she said, smiling. Her voice was calm, like she was commenting on the weather. You nodded, keeping your expression neutral. "Long night." She stepped inside, uninvited. Her eyes scanned the room, slow and deliberate, like she was mapping it. "Funny thing about this place," she said. "You think you've seen all of it, but there's always more." You didn't answer. You wanted to, but something in her eyes stopped you. She sat on the edge of your bed, smoothing her skirt. "You've been exploring." It wasn't a question. You stayed near the door, hand brushing the wall behind you. "Only the parts Magda lets us use." Isolde tilted her head, still smiling. "That's good. Some of the other parts aren't meant for everyone." There was a pause. Then she leaned forward slightly. "You know what they used to do here before it was a brothel?" she asked. You shook your head. "Confessions," she said. "The kind people don't say out loud. The kind you bury. The kind that need blood to be heard." Your mouth felt dry. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you already know," she whispered. "And I think it's time you made a choice." She stood, brushing imaginary dust from her sleeves. "We're not like the others. You feel it, don't you?" You didn't respond. She smiled again, soft and almost sweet this time. "I'll come back tomorrow. Maybe you'll be ready then." And just like that, she was gone. You locked the door behind her. You'd never done that before. Sleep didn't come easy. When it did, it was filled with dreams, of red circles drawn on floors, of women whispering in languages you didn't know, of Isolde's eyes watching you from the corner of the room. When you woke, there was something new beside your bed, a small pouch of salt, and a single white feather. You stared at it for a long time, heart thudding against your ribs. What kind of place had this become? And more importantly, what had you become to it? Because now it wasn't just about survival. It was about secrets, and they were no longer staying buried. The morning came heavy with fog, the kind that curled under doors and clung to skin like wet linen. You wrapped your shawl tighter as you sat on the edge of your bed, staring at the pouch of salt and the feather. The objects didn't make sense on their own, but they meant something. You were sure of it. Someone had left them for you. Not a message in words, but a warning in symbols. A quiet kind of language meant only for those who already understood. And though you didn't yet, A part of you whispered, "You will." You tucked them away inside the loose floorboard beside the book. The more you thought about it, the more it made sense. Someone knew what you had found. Someone had seen you take the book, but they hadn't tried to take it back. Not yet, which meant they were waiting to see what you'd do next. In the brothel's main hall, things carried on like normal. The day girls folded linens and lit fresh candles. The cook grumbled about flour prices. The girls who worked through the night stumbled around bleary-eyed with tangles in their hair. But the air was thick and no one laughed. Conversations ended when you entered a room. May avoided your gaze completely. And Isolde? She wasn't anywhere to be seen. Magda called for you in the late afternoon. You found her sitting at the round table in her private room, a place very few girls ever stepped foot in. Her tea was already poured, her hands folded over a lace handkerchief. She didn't smile. "Sit," she said. "You did." She studied you for a long moment before speaking. "I don't care what you found. The past is best left where it lies. The girls here, they work, they survive, and if they're lucky, they leave. That's how it's always been." You nodded, unsure if this was a warning or a lecture. But sometimes, she continued, her voice lower now, someone comes along and forgets the rules. They dig. They listen too closely. They open doors meant to stay shut. And then they wonder why the house begins to fall around them. "I didn't mean to." "You did," Magda interrupted. "And now that you have, there's no going back." A long silence stretched between you. "I've seen this before," she said. "Girls get curious. And every time, something is lost. One went mad. One ran into the river and never came out. One just disappeared." You thought of the drawing in the book, the women in the circles. Were they the same? Had someone drawn them? "Isolde," you began. But Magda held up a hand. "She's not your concern. Not anymore." You hesitated. "What is she?" Magda's eyes flashed, and for the first time, you saw real fear there. Not anger. Not control. Fear. "I don't know," she whispered. "And I don't want to." She stood and turned away, signaling the conversation was over. But just as you reached the door, her voice stopped you again. "If she comes to you again, don't speak. Don't answer. Just listen. That's the only thing that might keep you safe." You returned to your room shaken, not from Magda's words, but from the fact that Magda was shaken. That woman didn't bend to anything. Not the constables, not the church, not even the nobles who came through her doors pretending they were above it all. But Isolde had rattled her. That meant something. By nightfall, you couldn't take it anymore. You needed answers. Real ones. You pulled the book from beneath the floorboards, lit a candle, and sat cross-legged on the floor. The feather and salt lay beside you like quiet sentinels. You flipped through the pages again, slower this time, tracing the ink with your fingers. Some of the words looked familiar now. One page repeated a phrase 3 times. Asterisk serva lucem. Serva lucem. Serva lucem. Asterisk. You'd heard it in church once. Keep the light. And suddenly, something clicked. The salt. The feather. The words. Protection. Someone had given you a charm. A shield. That meant someone else had seen the danger, too. You flipped to the final pages of the book, where the drawings became more frantic. The lines were jagged, rushed. The faces of the women more twisted, their eyes gone wide and blank. Some had marks on their foreheads, red circles like the thread. Others had symbols around their wrists. You could barely breathe as you looked. Then you turned one last page and froze. There she was, Isolde, drawn perfectly. Her sharp cheekbones, the slope of her neck, the slight smirk at the corner of her mouth. There was no mistaking it. The artist had known her face well. But it wasn't just her. She was kneeling, surrounded by women. Not alive, dead. And she was smiling. The ink around her was darker than the rest. So dark it almost gleamed. There were words beneath the image, not Latin this time, but something older. Something you didn't recognize. But the symbols around them matched what you'd seen on the doors of the chapel. Circles within circles. Some were broken. Some were whole. You stared at it until your candle sputtered low. Then you closed the book and stood, heart pounding. You didn't want to be here anymore. Not in this room. Not with this knowledge. You stepped into the hallway and nearly screamed. Isolde was there, waiting. She smiled like she'd been standing outside your door for hours. "I said I'd return," she whispered. Your knees nearly buckled, but you held firm. I found the book, you said. I saw what's in it. She tilted her head. And you're in it. Her smile widened. Of course I am. I wrote half of it. The hallway felt colder now. The candle in your hand barely flickered. What are you? You asked. Isolde didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer and gently touched the side of your face. I'm the truth they buried, she whispered. The one they couldn't burn. The one that waited. You didn't move. She leaned in, her breath cool against your ear. And now, she said softly, you've seen too much. You backed away, clutching your candle, heart racing. But before you could speak again, before you could even blink, she was gone, vanished like smoke in the wind. And down the hall, behind the closed doors of the other girls' rooms, not a single sound could be heard. You didn't go back to your room. Not right away. You stayed in the hallway, gripping the candle, watching for any flicker of movement in the shadows. The air felt too still, like the building itself was waiting. The walls creaked more than usual. The wind pressed harder against the windows, and your heartbeat felt like the only sound in the world. Every instinct told you to run. But where? You had no family left, no coin to your name, and nowhere in the town would take you in once they heard where you worked. Leaving wasn't simple. It never had been. Eventually, when your legs started to tremble and your candle dripped wax onto your wrist, you turned and went back inside. You shoved the book deeper under the floorboards and pushed the old dresser over the hiding spot. Then you sat on the bed, back against the wall, waiting for morning. Your eyes stayed open until the gray light of dawn slid across the windowsill. By the time the sun was fully up, the brothel had returned to its usual rhythm. The girls were in the kitchen sipping broth, talking quietly, avoiding your eyes. Magda didn't speak to you, didn't even glance your way. The silence around you had thickened. You were no longer just a girl who worked the rooms. You were the one who'd seen something, the one who knew. And no one wanted to be near that. That afternoon, when the brothel was quieter, you slipped outside for the first time in weeks. The air was crisp, and the streets were muddy from the previous night's rain. People bustled past with baskets and carts, calling out prices, swearing at donkeys, laughing. For a moment, it all felt so normal, so harmless. It made what had happened inside feel like a dream. But the longer you walked, the more you noticed. Eyes followed you, not just in curiosity, but recognition. An old woman selling dried herbs leaned toward you as you passed and muttered, "Mark on you." Then she turned away without another word. A child pointed at your skirt and whispered something to his sister before their nurse pulled them down the street. You reached the small chapel near the market square, one of the only places in town that ever felt calm. The priest, Father Rowan, stood at the doorway, speaking with a baker. When he saw you, his expression shifted. Not unkind, but cautious. You stepped closer. "I need help," you said, voice low. He nodded once and motioned you inside. The chapel was quiet, filled with the smell of wax and the warmth of old wood. You sat in the back pew while he lit a candle at the altar. "You're one of Magda's girls," he said gently. You nodded. "Do you know a woman named Isolde?" The priest's back stiffened slightly. "I do," he said after a pause. "But not in the way most do. She said she wrote a book. A strange one." He turned to face you fully now, eyes sharp beneath his calm tone. "You've seen it." "Yes." He exhaled and sat beside you, folding his hands. "That book was hidden a long time ago, buried beneath the old cathedral ruins before the war. The church feared it, said it contained rituals from the oldest days, before the saints, before the written word. When women spoke to the stars and the earth answered back." Your mouth went dry. "Is it real?" His eyes met yours. "Does it feel real?" You didn't answer. You didn't have to. "There's more than one kind of power," he said. "Some born of faith, others of silence. Women like Isolde were not witches, not in the way tales tell. They were keepers, witnesses. But when they were hunted, some turned dark, became something else, not out of evil, but out of grief." You felt a chill crawl down your spine. She said she's the truth they buried. "Perhaps she is," he whispered. "But truth can be a blade, and blades cut both ways." Before you could say more, someone stepped into the chapel, a tall man in a dark cloak. The priest's eyes flicked to him, then back to you. "You should go," he said quickly. "Don't speak of the book. Not here. Not again. But go," he urged. before others notice. You left through the back door, heart pounding. The alley smelled of wet ash and old bread. You hurried back through the streets, keeping your hood up, your eyes down. You didn't look back until you reached the brothel gates. Inside, the mood had shifted. Girls gathered in clusters, whispering. One of them, young Brita, ran past you with tears in her eyes. Another girl sat at the stairs, face pale, biting her nails. You grabbed May by the elbow. What happened? She looked at you like she'd just seen a ghost. Magda's gone. What? She's gone, May repeated. Her room was locked this morning. When they opened it, the fire was out, her bed untouched. She left her coin, her ledgers, everything. Just vanished. You stared at her, stunned. No one left without warning. No one left Magda's post. May leaned closer. And something else. What? She hesitated. There was a circle, burned into the floor, right where she used to kneel to pray. No one knows what it means. But the wood is scorched deep. They try to scrub it, but it won't come out. You ran up the stairs 2 at a time. Magda's door was open now. Her room smelled like lavender and something burnt. The circle was there, black as tar, carved into the floorboards with ash trailing out from it like smoke. No sign of her clothes, her boots, or her heavy ring of keys. But you did notice something on the windowsill. A single white feather. You stepped closer, reaching for it. Then from somewhere deep in the walls behind you, you heard it. A laugh. Soft. Familiar. And not quite human. You didn't touch the feather. You couldn't. Your hand hovered above it, trembling slightly, but something deep inside warned you not to disturb it. Like it was less an object and more message. A mark. And the moment you acknowledged it, everything would change again. You stepped back slowly, eyes still on the window. The room had fallen unnaturally quiet, quieter than it should be, even in an old brothel. The kind of silence that felt like it was pressing against your ears, as though sound had been sucked out of the air. The girls downstairs continued to murmur in anxious tones, but up here, it felt like another world entirely. The laugh echoed again, faint but closer now. Not cruel exactly, just amused, knowing, like someone had seen you make the next move on a chessboard and was already 3 steps ahead. It didn't come from the hallway or the window. It came from within, from behind the very walls. You backed out of Magda's room, shutting the door carefully behind you. When you turned, May was standing there, wide-eyed. You heard it too, she whispered. You nodded. It's her. May didn't need to ask who. She already knew. The 2 of you hurried down the corridor, past the girls' rooms, toward the back stairs. You didn't stop until you were back in the laundry room, the steam from the wash tubs fogging the cracked windows. Here, the noise of boiling water and creaking pipes made it feel like the world still made sense. But it didn't. She's not like the rest of us, May said, wringing out a linen with shaky hands. Isolde. She doesn't eat, doesn't sleep. Sometimes I see her standing in the garden before dawn, just watching the sky. She told me she wrote the book, you said, and Father Rowan knew her too. He said she's older than she looks, that the book came from before the church, even had names for things. May sat on a stool and hugged her knees. I think she's waiting. For something. Or someone. Maybe both. You looked toward the hallway, then back to her. What happened to Magda? May shook her head slowly. Gone. Like the others before her. I think she tried to stop whatever's coming. Maybe even try to seal it away again. But it's too late now. What do you mean? She knew it had to be passed down? May whispered. All of it. The book, the knowledge, the thread, the signs. Every girl who made it to the end had to choose. Walk away and forget, or stay and become something else. And Magda chose to stay. You finished. May nodded. Your mind was racing. The book, the key, the feather, the strange Latin, the burned circle. It wasn't just a haunting. It wasn't even just a curse. It was a pattern, a cycle that repeated girl after girl, generation after generation. And now, for whatever reason, it had come down to you. You didn't want it. You wanted out. You wanted a quiet life, even if it meant scrubbing floors or fetching water from a muddy well. But there was no escaping it now. Not with the book under your floorboard. Not with Isolde in the halls. You went back to your room as dusk fell. This time, the corridor felt colder than usual. You passed Ellen's old room, the door now slightly ajar. You paused for a moment. The room was dark, the bed stripped. You stepped inside. The silence was different here. Not threatening, just hollow. You glanced around, your eyes adjusting. On the floor near the window sat a small wooden box. You knelt and opened it carefully. Inside were a few forgotten things: an old comb, a brooch with a missing stone, and a piece of parchment folded tightly. You unfolded it. There, written in Ellen's hurried hand, were 5 words. She walks between the hours. Beneath it was a small sketch. Circles. Again. You put the paper in your pocket and backed out of the room, heart beating fast. When you returned to your room, the floor felt colder than before. You knelt to the hiding spot and pulled up the loose board. The book was still there, but something else had been added. A candle, black wax, wrapped in a bit of fabric with dried petals and a single, short, red thread knotted around its base. Another message, another step in whatever this ritual was. You didn't know what to do with it. You wanted to throw it out the window, but part of you knew better. This wasn't random. It was instruction. It was preparation. That night, you didn't light your usual candles. You sat in the dark with only the window open, watching the moon rise behind the chimney stacks. You thought about Isolde, about the chapel under the brothel, about Magda kneeling on the floor where that circle had burned. Then you saw her, just beyond the window, standing in the garden below, her face turned toward the moon. Isolde, still as stone. She didn't look up, didn't move, just stood there, barefoot, in a white shift that fluttered slightly in the wind. You couldn't look away. Then, slowly, deliberately, her head turned toward you. And though the garden was bathed in silver and shadow, you could see her eyes perfectly. They were black, not from the absence of light, but from something else. You dropped the curtain. The next morning, 2 girls were gone. No note, no explanation. One had left a ribbon behind on her pillow, the other a drawing. Circles. Magda's old room was still empty. The burn mark had faded slightly, but no one touched it. No one spoke of it. You tried to act normal, to serve the usual patrons, to laugh at their jokes, but everything felt wrong. Hollow, like the brothel itself was slowly being hollowed out from the inside. And then, that night, a knock came at your door. 3 times. Slow. Measured. You knew who it was. You opened it anyway. Isolde stood there, as calm as ever. "Come with me," she said. You didn't ask where. You didn't speak. You followed. Through the corridor. Down the hidden stairs. Back to the chapel beneath the house. But this time, the chapel was different. Candles burned at every corner, casting tall shadows against the stone. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and ash. At the center of the room, on the altar, the book sat open. Pages fluttered gently despite the stillness of the air. Around it stood 5 women. Some you recognized, others you'd never seen before. None of them spoke. Isolde stepped forward. You've seen the signs. You follow the thread. And now you must choose. You looked at the women. Their eyes gleamed in the candlelight. Not with malice, but with knowing. You looked at the book, then at the circle burned into the stone at your feet. And suddenly, you understood. This wasn't a trap. It was a test. And the next move was yours. You stepped forward, and the candles went out. For a heartbeat, everything was swallowed by black. No flicker, no slow dimming. Just darkness, sudden and complete. You froze where you stood, heart thudding against your ribs, trying to hear past your panic. The thick, earthy scent of wax and herbs still clung to the air. But the silence was so complete it felt unnatural, like the chapel had been pulled out of the world above and dropped into another realm entirely. You didn't call out. Somehow you knew that would be a mistake. Then a sound, soft, deliberate, feet brushing across stone. A hand touched your arm. Not rough, not cold, but grounding. Isolde. You didn't need to see her to know it was her. Her presence was distinct, like the chill, just before a storm, the space between breath and thunder. This is the moment. Her voice came, low and clear in the dark. All that came before was the path. But this is the gate. What happens if I say no? You ask quietly. A pause. Then you return upstairs, back to the bed, the linens, the men. You'll serve drinks, smile on command, and forget what you've seen. Slowly, the memory will rot, and you'll be one more girl who left no trace. And if I say yes, Isolde's hand slid away. Then you become part of what's always been. That answer frightened you more. Something about this wasn't just a secret society or an old ritual. It was deeper than that, older. The kind of thing not spoken aloud because the words didn't survive. You remember the drawings in the book, the burned circle, Magda's absence, the white feather. None of this was ordinary. This was transformation, a death of one life, and the beginning of something else. The candles flared to life again. You blinked against the light. The altar was lit. The book was open to a new page. You'd never seen this one before. It was blank except for a single phrase. Asterisk. She who chooses carries the thread. Asterisk. Isolde stood beside it, her hands at her sides, waiting. The other women watched silently, forming a circle around the room. Their expressions were unreadable. Not hostile, not kind. Just still, as if waiting for you to make the final move in a game that had been played long before you were born. You stepped forward, slowly, your feet brushing the edge of the circle carved into the stone. Your fingertips hovered over the open page. I don't know what I'm agreeing to, you said. No one ever does, Isolde replied. Your eyes met hers. She wasn't lying, and she wasn't smiling now. She looked solemn, almost human, tired, and for the first time since meeting her, you saw something else in her gaze. Loneliness. You placed your hand on the page. The moment your skin touched the parchment, something unseen moved through the room. Not wind, not light, a pulse, like the walls had exhaled. The candles flickered outward, flames growing taller. The scent of burning herbs thickened. Your vision blurred. Then a voice, not spoken, not heard, but inside you. Asterisk, remember what was lost. Asterisk, images filled your mind. Not memories, not dreams. Women, long before you, standing where you stood, binding thread around wrists, marking circles in ash and honey, singing in languages forgotten by time. Their faces blurred, but their purpose clear, to keep something hidden, or maybe to keep something in. You pulled your hand back with a gasp. The chapel was still again. The candles lowered. The book remained open. Isolde watched you, the corners of her mouth turned down ever so slightly. Not with disappointment, with understanding. It's not a burden, she said softly. It's a legacy, carried by those who endure. You looked around the room. The other women now stood with their heads bowed. One of them, an older woman with white hair braided down her back, stepped forward and held out a small pouch. You took it. It was the same kind you'd found beside your bed, a mix of salt and dried herbs. A token, a talisman. It is done, the white-haired woman said simply. Isolde nodded. The circle opened. You were no longer in the center. Not a guest, not a novice. You were part of it now. The group dispersed without ceremony. No chants, no applause. Just quiet steps fading into the walls, into stairwells and corridors, and hidden spaces within the brothel you'd never seen before. Isolde lingered. You'll still work, she said. That part doesn't change. They still need a girl upstairs. But now you see more. You protect more. From what? You asked. She turned, her voice distant. From what always comes. Then she was gone, like smoke, slipping into some unseen crack in the chapel. You made your way back up alone, clutching the pouch, your body unsteady as if something inside had shifted. The brothel was still. The girls had gone to bed. No lamps burned in the hallway. You entered your room and froze. The dresser had been moved. The floorboard pulled up. The book gone. Panic shot through you. You dropped to your knees, searching, your hands sweeping over the wood into corners under the bed. Nothing. Then you saw it. On your pillow. A piece of parchment. You picked it up slowly. 2 words. Asterisk, watch carefully. Asterisk. No signature. No mark. You sank onto the bed, heart pounding, your thoughts a jumble of fear and questions. Who had taken the book? Was it one of the women? Or someone else entirely? The window creaked. You turned. Outside, in the garden, the moon was high, and standing in its silver light, just as before, was Isolde. But this time, she wasn't alone. 3 figures stood behind her, faceless in the dark, all watching your window. None of them moved, and though the glass separated you, you could feel them watching. Not your face, your soul. You drew the curtain shut and leaned back against the wall. Sleep did not come. Because now you knew. This wasn't just about the brothel. It wasn't even about the book. It was about you. And something, had chosen you long before you ever stepped through that red door. You didn't sleep. You didn't even pretend to. You sat on the edge of the bed with the curtain drawn tight, the message still clenched in your hand. Watch carefully. The words repeated in your head like a warning and a command, blending into the silence of the room. Outside, the garden had returned to stillness, but the image of those three figures lingered in your mind, sharp and clear. You knew they had come for a reason, but not to take, to test, or maybe to choose again. By morning, you still hadn't moved. The brothel stirred to life slowly, like it always did. Boots clattered down the stairs, voices yawned into the hallway, and the scent of broth drifted up from the kitchens. Girls laughed, cried, whispered, all pretending the night had been nothing more than routine. But you knew it wasn't. Not anymore. Something had shifted, and it wasn't just in you. The moment you stepped into the corridor, you felt it. The walls felt closer, the floor colder. Even the light through the windows looked grayer than it had the day before. And when you passed by Ellen's old room again, you noticed the door wasn't just ajar, it was wide open. You hadn't seen that in weeks. Inside, nothing looked out of place. The bed was still bare, the floor swept clean, but on the wall above the fireplace, someone had drawn something in ash. A circle, perfectly round. No one else seemed to notice. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't speak of it. That was the pattern here. No one asked questions. Everyone already knew, they just chose silence over truth. You closed the door gently and continued downstairs. May sat at the long table with her arms crossed, her breakfast untouched. Her eyes flicked to you, then back to the bowl. She took the book, didn't she? You nodded slowly. I thought she might. May muttered. You're not the first. That's how it starts. How it starts, you asked. May's voice lowered. The choosing, the shifting, the power doesn't stay still. It moves through the house, finds new hands, but the ones who carry it never carry it long. You sat down across from her. Why me? She shrugged. Why any of us? Maybe because we're broken. Or maybe because we're paying for something someone else did. There was silence between you. Then she said, Did you know Isolde's room doesn't have a bed? You blinked. What? I saw it once. Door cracked open. Just a mirror. A chair. No bed. No clothes. Like she doesn't live here, just waits. You didn't know what to say. You didn't want to believe it. But it fit. Everything about Isolde felt like a shape you couldn't quite hold. Solid 1 second, shifting the next. Later that evening, as dusk slipped into the brothel like a soft whisper, you were called to the parlor. A guest had arrived. You hadn't expected anyone that night. Most of the men who came were familiar, drunks, merchants, off-duty guards. But this one was different. He wore fine clothes, but not flashy. His boots were polished, but covered in just enough dust to say he'd traveled far. And when he looked at you, his gaze didn't linger on your face or your body. It stayed on your eyes, like he was measuring something beneath them. You're the one they're watching, he said, voice calm, quiet. You froze. What? He reached into his coat and placed something on the table. A dried sprig of rosemary, wrapped in cloth. I'm only here to warn you, he said. They're not all on the same side. You stared at him. Who are you? I was like you once, he said. Only I ran. Thought I could escape it. But it doesn't care about distance. Or time. What is it? You asked. He looked down, then back up at you. A memory of something that never died. Before you could ask more, Isolde entered the room. The air shifted instantly. The man stood, bowed slightly, and said, I've done what I came to do. He left without another word. You turned to her. Who was that? Isolde's smile didn't reach her eyes. Someone who mistook courage for permission. You wanted to press, but something about her posture warned you not to. Instead, she motioned for you to follow. You walked behind her, past the common rooms, up the stairs to the attic, an area locked for as long as you'd been here. Tonight, the door was open. Inside was dust, boxes, and silence. But also something else. Carved into the floorboards were names. Dozens of them. Some faded, others fresh. Women's names. You knelt, running your fingers over one. Ellen. She said she saw things before she vanished. You whispered. Isolde nodded. They all do. right before the end. You looked up at her. End of what? But Isolde didn't answer. She pointed instead to a name at the far corner of the room, one carved deeper than the others, with fresh ash still clinging to the letters. Yours. You stumbled back. How? You've already crossed the threshold, she said. The house has chosen. Your voice was barely audible. So what happens now? Isolde knelt beside you, her expression unreadable. Now, she said, you begin to remember. And then, for the first time, you realized she wasn't just speaking of your own past. She meant something far older, something buried deep within the walls. And somewhere far below you, in the chapel, or in the ground beneath it, something began to stir. The sound came like a whisper at first, so soft you thought it might be your own thoughts echoing. But as you stood in that attic, surrounded by the names of women whose stories had been erased, you realized it wasn't in your head. It was coming from below, deep, deep below. A low, rhythmic hum, almost like chanting, almost like breathing. You glanced at Isolde, expecting fear or surprise. But she only stood there, still and calm, as though she'd been waiting for this moment for a very long time. What is that? You whispered. Isolde didn't turn to you. It's always been there. You're just now starting to hear it. You looked again at the name carved into the wood, asterisk your asterisk name. It hadn't been there when you came in. You were sure of it. But now it was scorched deep into the grain, darker and fresher than any other. Your throat tightened. I didn't choose this. No one does, she said softly. The house remembers. It waits. It calls. Calls what? Whatever it needs, Isolde replied. A gust of cold air swept through the attic, though there were no open windows. You hugged your arms tightly and turned in a slow circle, staring at the sea of names. Hundreds of them, maybe more. Women you'd never known. Women no one remembered. They were all here? You asked. Isolde nodded. Some stayed. Some vanished. Some were taken. Taken by what? She didn't answer. But that low, vibrating sound was growing louder, pulsing beneath your feet like a second heartbeat. You took a step back from the names, suddenly aware of how close the darkness in the attic pressed against the candlelight. You didn't want to be here anymore. Not in this place. Not with your name now part of the floorboards. Isolde stepped aside, allowing you to pass. She didn't speak again as you walked down the creaking stairs, through the hall, and back into your room. But just before you closed the door, she said, sleep lightly. It comes when you dream. You barely slept. And when you did, it wasn't sleep in the way you understood it. It was falling, sinking, slipping into something too deep and too old to name. You saw the chapel again, but not as it was now. As it used to be, grand, golden, filled with chanting. Women in white robes stood in circles, whispering prayers with hands outstretched. Then blood. So much blood. Circles drawn in it, marked across faces, symbols pressed into flesh. The robes turned red. The light turned black. You tried to wake, but couldn't. A voice spoke through it all, rising over the chaos. Not cruel, not loud, but absolute. Asterisk, she who holds the thread holds the door. Asterisk, you woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the dawn just beginning to touch the windows. The world felt changed. You felt changed, like something had been stirred loose inside your bones. Something that had been waiting. There was a knock. 3 taps. You froze. It wasn't your door. It was Ellen's. You crept into the hallway. The door was closed. You held your breath. Then, it opened. Slowly. Quietly. No one was inside, but something had been. A red thread, knotted and looped, hung from the edge of the bed frame. Just like the one you'd found on your own door that first night. You walked inside. It felt like stepping into a memory. Like the air itself had weight. You knelt at the thread and picked it up carefully. It was damp. Fresh. You followed it around the edge of the bed where it disappeared beneath the floorboards. A loose board had been pried up. You lifted it. Beneath was a small wooden box. You hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a mirror. Cracked. But the reflection wasn't yours. It was hers. Ellen's. Her face pale, eyes wide, lips parted slightly like she was on the verge of speaking. Then the image shattered, just like the glass, and you were left staring at your own face, warped and broken in the reflection. You shut the box and backed away, heart pounding. As you turned to leave, a breeze swept through the room and the window slammed shut. You ran back to your room. You didn't stop until you were behind your locked door, pressing your back against the wood, chest heaving. The mirror still burned in your mind. Ellen's expression wasn't one of terror. It was warning. You pulled the pouch of salt from beneath your bed and sprinkled a line across the threshold. You didn't know if it would work. You didn't even know who'd given it to you anymore. But it was something, and right now, something was better than nothing. That night, the brothel was quiet. Too quiet. Even the girls who usually whispered late into the evening stayed silent behind their doors. You sat at your window, watching the garden. No one came. No figures in the moonlight. No Isolde. Just silence. And still that feeling that something was coming. You drifted off eventually, head against the cold glass, one hand still holding the pouch. When you woke, it was to a scream. Sharp, ragged, real. You bolted upright and ran into the hall, the other girls already pouring from their rooms. May was at the end of the corridor, her hands covering her mouth. Her door was open. Inside, another name, freshly carved. Not hers. Yours. Again, this time on her wall, dark and deep. Below it, a circle burned into the wood, identical to the one in Magda's old room. Isolde appeared behind you all. We warned you, she said softly. It doesn't stop. It never has. You turned to her. Then what do we do? Isolde looked at you, and for the first time, there was no calm in her expression. No mystery, just sorrow. You go back, she said. You go under. And in your chest, you knew what she meant. Back to the chapel. Back to the place where it had all begun. Back beneath the brothel floorboards, where something older than memory had stirred once more. Waiting for its chosen. Waiting for you. The candle in your hand shook slightly as you stood at the top of the basement stairs, its flame trembling against the dark. The others were gone now, retreated behind closed doors, whispering prayers they barely remembered. May hadn't spoken since that morning. She hadn't touched her breakfast. She just sat in her room staring at the burned name on the wall, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. No one tried to comfort her. No one really knew how. And now, here you were, the only one still moving, still trying. The only one willing to go back beneath the house. Back under. You stepped down slowly, your bare feet cold against the stone. The further you went, the more the air thickened, like walking into a room filled with wet wool and smoke. Each stair groaned under your weight, as though warning you to turn around. But you didn't, because the voice in your head had returned. Soft but steady, not your own, she who holds the thread. The candlelight flared slightly as you reached the bottom. The hidden chapel opened up before you, just as it had before, but somehow darker now, as though the shadows had stretched, as though the stone itself had forgotten the sun. The book was back on the altar. You knew it was the same one, though you'd never seen this version of it before. It looked older, colder, its cover cracked, pages stained with something darker than ink. But you didn't hesitate. You walked straight to it, and this time you didn't ask questions. You placed your hand on the open page. Your breath caught in your throat. It was like plunging your hand into ice and fire at once. A sudden jolt of sensation that raced up your arm, through your shoulder, into your chest. Your knees buckled slightly, and you gripped the edge of the altar to steady yourself. The chapel flickered. Once. Twice. Then it changed. The candles burned taller. The air turned warm, humid, and perfumed. You were no longer alone. The chapel was full. Women surrounded you, just like in your dream. Robes of cream and red, eyes half closed in trance, arms raised in slow, deliberate movement. They didn't speak, but you could hear them, feel them. Asterisk, keep the door. Carry the thread. Remember the names. Asterisk, your heart beat wildly in your chest. And then, through the crowd, you saw her. Ellen, but not broken, not afraid. She was one of them now, her hair braided back, a red mark painted on her forehead. Her eyes met yours, and she smiled. You reached for her. The vision shattered. The room snapped back to the cold stone and dim candlelight. You were alone again, breathing hard. The book now lay closed. But in your hand was something new, a needle, silver, sharp. tied to a red thread. You didn't know what it meant, but you knew you couldn't leave it behind. You took it with you, tucked into your dress, and returned to the main floor. The house was still quiet. Too quiet. The other girls were locked away, behind doors they hoped could keep the dark out. But you knew better now. The dark wasn't outside the door. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, in the name carved into May's room, in the name now burned into your own skin. You looked down and gasped. The thread was tied around your wrist. You didn't remember wrapping it, didn't remember it being there. But now it was, and your wrist pulsed faintly beneath it, like the thread had its own heartbeat. The needle sat in your palm, waiting. The next 3 days passed in a blur. Time twisted strangely in the brothel. You would wake, work, eat, sleep. Only you weren't sure any of it was real. Faces blurred, voices echoed, and through it all, you heard the hum. Not always, not everywhere, but when it came, it was always at night, when the wind stopped, when the air grew still. And each time it came, something else changed. A new symbol carved into the floor. A window that refused to open. Girls whispering in their sleep in languages they had never learned. May stopped speaking altogether. On the third night, you found her standing at the edge of the garden, barefoot and pale, her eyes fixed on the moon. You touched her shoulder gently. May. She didn't blink. They're coming, she whispered. But it's not her anymore. It's them. You swallowed hard. Who? May turned to you slowly. Her eyes were rimmed with dark circles. Her lips trembled. The ones we forgot. The ones they buried under stone and ash. The ones who bled the first time the circle was drawn. Before you could respond, a rustling sound came from behind the hedges. You turned, heart racing. Nothing, but you felt it. Something watching. Something waiting. You grabbed May's hand and pulled her inside, bolting the door behind you. That night, you dream again. But this time, you weren't in the chapel. You were in the brothel. Only, it wasn't the same. It was rotting, walls crumbling, doors off their hinges, dust in every corner, and in every room, echoes. Laughter, weeping, screaming. The house was remembering, not just lives, but deaths. And you were watching every one of them. You woke before the last scream finished. You couldn't stay passive anymore. The brothel wasn't just haunted, it was feeding. And the longer you waited, the more it took. You went to Isolde's door. You knocked once. No answer. You opened it. Just as May said, no bed. No clothes. Only a mirror. And in the mirror, not your reflection, just your eyes, staring back at you, bleeding. You backed out of the room and ran to the chapel again. You needed answers. Real ones. The kind the book couldn't give you. The kind Isolde wouldn't say aloud. You flung open the trapdoor and descended fast, the candle flickering in your hand. But this time, someone was already there. A girl, kneeling at the altar. A girl you'd never seen before. She looked young, pale, thread around both wrists. You stepped forward slowly. Who are you? She looked up, and you gasped. She had your face, but younger, different. Her voice came hollow and distant. I held it before you. You stepped back. What do you mean? I chose. I fell. I was forgotten. Your breath caught. You're not real. I was, she whispered. But no one remembered. Not even you. Then the room began to shake. The candle blew out. The floor cracked. And a voice, older than anything you'd ever heard, rose from the darkness. Asterisk. She who breaks the circle opens the gate. Asterisk. You stumbled backward. Fell. And everything went black. When you opened your eyes, you were back in your room. Sweat on your skin. Thread on your wrist. The needle in your hand. And on the wall across from your bed, a new circle. Fresh. And open. The candle in your hand shook slightly as you stood at the top of the basement stairs, its flame trembling against the dark. The others were gone now, retreated behind closed doors, whispering prayers they barely remembered. May hadn't spoken since that morning. She hadn't touched her breakfast. She just sat in her room staring at the burned name on the wall, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. No one tried to comfort her. No one really knew how. And now, here you were, the only one still moving, still trying. The only one willing to go back beneath the house. Back under. You stepped down slowly, your bare feet cold against the stone. The further you went, the more the air thickened, like walking into a room filled with wet wool and smoke. Each stair groaned under your weight, as though warning you to turn around. But you didn't, because the voice in your head had returned. Soft but steady, not your own, she who holds the thread. The candlelight flared slightly as you reached the bottom. The hidden chapel opened up before you, just as it had before, but somehow darker now, as though the shadows had stretched, as though the stone itself had forgotten the sun. The book was back on the altar. You knew it was the same one, though you'd never seen this version of it before. It looked older, colder, its cover cracked, pages stained with something darker than ink. But you didn't hesitate. You walked straight to it, and this time you didn't ask questions. You placed your hand on the open page. Your breath caught in your throat. It was like plunging your hand into ice and fire at once. A sudden jolt of sensation that raced up your arm, through your shoulder, into your chest. Your knees buckled slightly, and you gripped the edge of the altar to steady yourself. The chapel flickered. Once. Twice. Then it changed. The candles burned taller. The air turned warm, humid, and perfumed. You were no longer alone. The chapel was full. Women surrounded you, just like in your dream. Robes of cream and red, eyes half closed in trance, arms raised in slow, deliberate movement. They didn't speak, but you could hear them, feel them. Asterisk, keep the door. Carry the thread. Remember the names. Asterisk, your heart beat wildly in your chest. And then, through the crowd, you saw her. Ellen, but not broken, not afraid. She was one of them now, her hair braided back, a red mark painted on her forehead. Her eyes met yours, and she smiled. You reached for her. The vision shattered. The room snapped back to the cold stone and dim candlelight. You were alone again, breathing hard. The book now lay closed. But in your hand was something new, a needle, silver, sharp, tied to a red thread. You didn't know what it meant, but you knew you couldn't leave it behind. You took it with you, tucked into your dress, and returned to the main floor. The house was still quiet, too quiet. The other girls were locked away, behind doors they hoped could keep the dark out. But you knew better now. The dark wasn't outside the door. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, in the name carved into May's room, in the name now burned into your own skin. You looked down and gasped. The thread was tied around your wrist. You didn't remember wrapping it, didn't remember it being there. But now it was, and your wrist pulsed faintly beneath it, like the thread had its own heartbeat. The needle sat in your palm, waiting. The next 3 days passed in a blur. Time twisted strangely in the brothel. You would wake, work, eat, sleep. Only you weren't sure any of it was real. Faces blurred, voices echoed, and through it all, you heard the hum. Not always, not everywhere, but when it came, it was always at night, when the wind stopped, when the air grew still. And each time it came, something else changed. A new symbol carved into the floor. A window that refused to open. Girls whispering in their sleep in languages they had never learned. May stopped speaking altogether. On the third night, you found her standing at the edge of the garden, barefoot and pale, her eyes fixed on the moon. You touched her shoulder gently. May. She didn't blink. They're coming, she whispered. But it's not her anymore. It's them. You swallowed hard. Who? May turned to you slowly. Her eyes were rimmed with dark circles. Her lips trembled. The ones we forgot. The ones they buried under stone and ash. The ones who bled the first time the circle was drawn. Before you could respond, a rustling sound came from behind the hedges. You turned, heart racing. Nothing, but you felt it. Something watching. Something waiting. You grabbed May's hand and pulled her inside, bolting the door behind you. That night, you dream again. But this time, you weren't in the chapel. You were in the brothel. Only, it wasn't the same. It was rotting, walls crumbling, doors off their hinges, dust in every corner, and in every room, echoes. Laughter, weeping, screaming. The house was remembering, not just lives, but deaths. And you were watching every one of them. You woke before the last scream finished. You couldn't stay passive anymore. The brothel wasn't just haunted, it was feeding. And the longer you waited, the more it took. You went to Isolde's door. You knocked once. No answer. You opened it. Just as May said, no bed. No clothes. Only a mirror. And in the mirror? Not your reflection, just your eyes, staring back at you, bleeding. You backed out of the room and ran to the chapel again. You needed answers. Real ones. The kind the book couldn't give you. The kind Isolde wouldn't say aloud. You flung open the trapdoor and descended fast, the candle flickering in your hand. But this time, someone was already there. A girl, kneeling at the altar. A girl you'd never seen before. She looked young, pale, thread around both wrists. You stepped forward slowly. Who are you? She looked up, and you gasped. She had your face, but younger, different. Her voice came hollow and distant. I held it before you. You stepped back. What do you mean? I chose. I fell. I was forgotten. Your breath caught. You're not real. I was, she whispered. But no one remembered. Not even you. Then the room began to shake. The candle blew out. The floor cracked. And a voice, older than anything you'd ever heard, rose from the darkness. Asterisk. She who breaks the circle opens the gate. Asterisk. You stumbled backward. Fell. And everything went black. When you opened your eyes, you were back in your room. Sweat on your skin. Thread on your wrist. The needle in your hand. And on the wall across from your bed. A new circle. Fresh. And open. You couldn't look away from the circle. It wasn't carved like the others. It was drawn, hurried, messy, with lines that trailed into the cracks of the wall. At first, it just looked like chalk or ash, maybe charcoal. But the closer you got, the more you realized it wasn't any of those. It shimmered faintly under the flicker of your candle, like it had soaked into the wall itself, like it was living in the stone. You reached out, without meaning to, fingertips brushing the edge of the symbol. The instant you touched it, a cold jolt traveled up your arm and into your chest. Your hand recoiled, but the sting remained, a pulse just beneath your skin, like a warning or a mark. The room felt tighter now, not smaller, just closer. You backed away slowly, eyes still locked on the unfinished circle. There was an opening in the line, a deliberate gap. Someone hadn't finished it, or someone was waiting for you to. You grabbed the needle from the dresser, the thread still knotted around your wrist, and left the room. The hall outside was silent, heavy, every door shut tight. No light came from under the thresholds. No voices whispered behind the walls. It was as if the house was holding its breath. You went straight to May's door and knocked once. Then again. No answer. You pushed it open. The bed was empty. The sheets untouched. The room was cold, like no one had stepped inside it for hours. You called her name once, quietly, not wanting to wake anything that might be listening. But no one answered. You turned and nearly jumped. Isolde was standing at the end of the hallway. She didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. You stepped toward her slowly. She's gone, you said. May's gone. Isolde's head tilted slightly, and her eyes darkened. No, she's still here. But the house is testing you now, just as it tested me. Your hands were trembling. What does it want? It wants what it always wants. A keeper, a gate, and a memory that won't fade. You stared at her, the frustration rising in your chest. Why won't you ever give me a straight answer? Isolde's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze. Because truth isn't straight. It's a spiral, and you're almost at the center. Then she turned and walked away, disappearing through the narrow door at the end of the corridor, the one that hadn't opened in years. You followed. Inside was a staircase that spiraled downward, narrow and damp, the air thick with the scent of old wood and something far older. You clutched the candle tightly as you descended, each step creaking beneath your feet. At the bottom, you reached a chamber you'd never seen before. Stone walls, a circle carved into the floor. But this one wasn't empty. May was there, standing in the center. Her wrists were bound with red thread, her eyes wide and glassy, her lips moving without sound. You stepped forward, but a force hit you like a wall, an invisible barrier keeping you out. Isolde stood beside her. She stepped into the thread before she was ready. Isolde said softly, "Now she's caught in the memory." You pressed your palms to the barrier. "Let me in." She called it, Isolde whispered. "And once it hears you, it doesn't forget." The candlelight flickered. The ground trembled beneath your feet. From the corners of the room, the shadows moved. They didn't have shapes, not exactly, but they had presence. You could feel them circling, watching, whispering in a language you didn't understand, but could somehow feel. The kind of voice that lives in your blood. Isolde turned to you. You know what you have to do. You looked down at your wrist. The red thread was glowing now, pulsing with that same rhythm you'd felt the night the circle first appeared. The needle in your hand felt heavier, warmer. You didn't want to know why. What if I fail? You asked, voice cracking. Isolde looked at you with something like sadness. Then the house begins again. It always does. You stepped into the circle, and the barrier dropped. The air thickened instantly, hot, pressing, as if you'd stepped into a storm about to break. You could barely see May now, her face flickering between familiar and unfamiliar, like she was caught between her own memory and someone else's. The circle beneath your feet began to glow. You dropped to your knees. The candle blew out. Complete darkness. But the thread in your wrist still glowed, a faint red light guiding your hand. You raised the needle. The thread right, alive, trembling in your grip. You didn't know what you were doing. You only knew that you had to do it. Your hands moved on instinct, stitching the thread into the stone floor, completing the final loop of the open circle. Each motion brought a sound, the rising hum of the house itself, vibrating in your bones. Shadows hissed at the edges of the chamber, circling faster, closer. May screamed. You drove a needle through the final gap. The circle closed, and everything stopped. Silence fell. The shadows froze. May collapsed, and the floor beneath you cracked. A jagged line split the circle in two, and from it came a gust of cold air so deep it felt like it came from the earth's core. And then, a voice. Not human, not old, something else. Asterisk, the thread is whole. The gate is ready. The keeper must choose. Asterisk, you looked down. Your hands were bleeding. Your wrist burned, and the stone beneath you was opening. You didn't know what lay beyond, but you knew. This was the end of running, and the beginning of whatever came next. You didn't want to move. The crack in the floor was narrow but deep, pulsing with a cold that didn't feel like air. It felt like memory, like loss. The needle had fallen from your hand, its red thread, now curling along the edge of the circle like a question mark no one had ever answered. May lay unconscious just outside the symbol, her breathing shallow but steady, her face pale and sweat-soaked. She was alive but changed, marked. You knelt beside her and brushed her hair back from her face. Her eyes twitched beneath closed lids, trapped in some silent dream. You whispered her name, but she didn't stir. You looked up to ask Isolde what to do next, but she was gone. Not in the room, not in the shadows, not anywhere. You were alone now. The gate, whatever it was, had opened for you, and now you had to decide whether to step forward or close it for good. You stood slowly, legs trembling, eyes fixed on the crack. The glow from the circle had faded, leaving only the dull shimmer of the red thread woven into the stone. You thought of the other women, the names in the attic, the whispers in the hall, the carved symbols on the wall. You thought of Ellen, of Magda, of the girl with your face in the chapel. And then, for just a second, you thought of your life before all of this. Before the brothel, before the house, before the dreams. You barely remembered it now. Just flashes, running through a rain-soaked field, the scent of lavender on your mother's apron, a warm loaf of bread cooling in a window. All gone, all drowned in this house. You turned back to May. You couldn't leave her. Not like this. You crouched beside her, hooked your arms beneath her shoulders, and slowly began dragging her out of the circle. Her weight felt wrong. Too light, too heavy, like she wasn't fully in this world anymore. You could feel the thread still pulsing against your wrist, tugging gently toward the gate. But you ignored it. Step by step, breath by breath, you move her away from the crack until her body crossed the edge of the symbol. As soon as she passed over it, the light in her face shifted. She gasped, sharp, sudden, and her eyes flew open. She stared at you, wild and disoriented. Where am I?" she whispered. You didn't answer right away. You were too stunned, too relieved. "You're okay," you whispered back. "You're safe." But the moment the words left your lips, something inside the circle screamed. Not with a voice, with rage. The thread snapped off your wrist like a whip, and the crack widened. Stone shattered outward with a sharp crack, and a gust of freezing air blew into the room. You shielded May with your body, trying to protect her from whatever was rising beneath the floor. The hum returned, louder than ever, no longer soft and distant but deafening. Writhing, you looked back and saw something moving in the gate. A hand, small, gray, twisted, but unmistakably human. Then another. Then eyes, not one pair but many, blinking, watching, studying you from below. The thing in the gate wasn't a creature. It was a collection of memory, of lives, of all the women who had fallen into the house and never escaped. They had become it. You scrambled back from the circle, clutching May tightly. The voice returned. Asterisk choose. Keeper. Choose. Asterisk. You screamed at the dark. I don't want this. But the house didn't care, because it wasn't offering a choice. It was issuing an invitation. The gate pulsed again, and from it rose a shape, tall, robed, faceless. Its form shimmered like smoke and bone, half there and half something else entirely. It didn't speak aloud, but its meaning thundered inside your skull. Close it and be forgotten. Step through and become memory. May pulled at your sleeve, weak but urgent. Don't go. You looked into her eyes. I have to, you whispered. You stood, shaking, the broken thread still wrapped tight in your fist. You stepped toward the edge of the gate. The shape waited, unmoving, its countless eyes blinking in eerie rhythm. You raised your hand, and the thread tightened around your wrist again, as if by magic, as if the house itself was drawing it closed. You knelt at the circle. One last loop remained undone. The thread hovered. The choice was still yours. Close it or finish it. You turned to May one last time. She was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks. I'll come back, you promised. She shook her head. No one ever does. You smiled gently, though your heart ached. Then I'll be the first. And you finished the circle. The gate flared in light. White, blinding. And then, nothing. Just silence. Cold, weightless. You opened your eyes. You were no longer in the chapel. No longer in the brothel. You stood in a field of ash beneath a red sky, circles drawn in the dirt in every direction. Women stood at the edge of each one. Some turned toward you. Others looked away. All of them carried red thread. And across from you, Isolde, smiling, but not like before. This time, she looked free. Welcome, she said softly. Keeper. You stepped toward her, the thread still glowing in your hand. And as the women closed their circles one by one, the sky began to shift. Not darker, but lighter, because the memory was no longer buried. It was awake. And for the first time in the brothel's long, haunted life, the house had a keeper who remembered. But the light didn't last. Just as quickly as it had come, the pale glow began to dim, and the field of ash grew darker, colder. The women around you, once steady and watchful, began to shift uneasily. Their forms flickered like candle flames in a gust of wind. The sky, no longer red, started to turn a deep, bruised purple, streaked with black clouds that churned like ink in water. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Isolde's smile faded. You turned to her, your voice barely steady. What's happening? She didn't answer at first. Her eyes were locked on the horizon. Someone's reopened a gate, she whispered. You looked out across the endless field. Circles surrounded you in every direction, each one faintly glowing with red thread. Some remained closed, silent, untouched, but one of them, far in the distance, had begun to unravel. The red thread pulled loose in slow, painful spirals, the circle breaking apart piece by piece. They're not supposed to open, you said. No, Isolde replied. They're not. A wind rose suddenly, shrill and cold, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of screaming, not of terror, but of memory, ancient and broken. It didn't come from the air. It came from beneath the ash. You knelt instinctively, pressing your hands into the ground. It was warm, then hot, then burning. One of the women stepped out of her circle. She was tall, older, with a scar across her jaw and a braid wrapped around her neck like a collar. Her voice was low and firm. You brought the thread back. That was the balance. But if another gate opens, the house will feed again. You looked at her, breath catching. Another keeper? Isolde's face had gone pale. No, not a keeper. You stood slowly, heart pounding, watching as the open circle on the horizon widened further. A shape was rising from it, not like the others. This one was jagged, malformed. Not a memory, but something trapped in one, something that should have stayed buried. The older woman turned to you, someone who refused the thread, someone who cut it. That made no sense. Every girl who cut the thread disappeared. The house never spoke of them again. But what if they didn't vanish? What if the house kept them alive? What if it turned them into something else? You backed away from the edge of your circle, fear rising in your throat. The sky above the broken gate tore open, and from it poured smoke, thick black, filled with the stench of iron and ash. Within the smoke, you saw a figure step forward, and you knew that face. May, only not as she was. Her eyes were pitch black, rimmed in red. Her skin was cracked, threaded with dark lines that pulsed beneath the surface. The same red thread that had once wrapped around your wrist now hung from her fingertips, soaked in something too dark to name. No, you breathed. She was saved. I pulled her out. Isolde didn't look at you. You pulled her body out, but the thread wasn't fully cut. May, or whatever she had become, raised her hand, and the ash beneath her feet scattered outward in waves. Circles collapsed one by one. Women screamed and vanished, their names burning away in the wind. You ran to Isolde, grabbing her wrist. There has to be a way to stop this. There is, she said slowly, her eyes locked on May. But it will cost you. The sky trembled. Everything. You didn't flinch. Tell me. Isolde pointed to the thread, still wound, around your wrist. It glowed faintly, but now it trembled with fear. You hold the original thread, she said. The first one, from the first keeper. It's why you were chosen, why the house answered you. But if May's gate remains open, the memory will consume everything. All of us, even the house. You swallowed hard, realization sinking in. So I close it. You become it, Isolde said. You anchor the memory. You thread it into yourself. The house survives, but you won't. You stood silent, the wind howling louder, the field growing darker. The broken gate opened fully now, and May's figure rose higher, surrounded by shadows that didn't walk but slithered, stretching and splitting like pieces of her own soul. Then, for just a second, May's eyes locked onto yours, and she smiled, not as a friend, as something else, a challenge. She raised her hand, and the last circles began to crumble. You turned back to Isolde, your decision made. But before you could speak, a voice rang out behind you. It was hers, the girl from the chapel, the one with your face. Only now, she looked older, stronger. Her eyes glowed. I remember now, she said, and in her hands, a needle, threaded, with something you couldn't see. Isolde gasped. She was the first. You stepped back, stunned. Then what am I? The girl turned to you. You're the last. And before you could ask anything else, the world shattered in red light. The memory had chosen, and the thread was far from finished. But the light didn't last. Just as quickly as it had come, the pale glow began to dim, and the field of ash grew darker, colder. The women around you, once steady and watchful, began to shift uneasily. Their forms flickered like candle flames in a gust of wind. The sky, no longer red, started to turn a deep, bruised purple, streaked with black clouds that churned like ink in water. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Isolde's smile faded. You turned to her, your voice barely steady. What's happening? She didn't answer at first. Her eyes were locked on the horizon. Someone's reopened a gate, she whispered. You looked out across the endless field. Circles surrounded you in every direction, each one faintly glowing with red thread. Some remained closed, silent, untouched, but one of them, far in the distance, had begun to unravel. The red thread pulled loose in slow, painful spirals, the circle breaking apart piece by piece. They're not supposed to open, you said. No, Isolde replied. They're not. A wind rose suddenly, shrill and cold, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of screaming, not of terror, but of memory, ancient and broken. It didn't come from the air. It came from beneath the ash. You knelt instinctively, pressing your hands into the ground. It was warm, then hot, then burning. One of the women stepped out of her circle. She was tall, older, with a scar across her jaw and a braid wrapped around her neck like a collar. Her voice was low and firm. You brought the thread back. That was the balance. But if another gate opens, the house will feed again. You looked at her, breath catching. Another keeper? Isolde's face had gone pale. No, not a keeper. You stood slowly, heart pounding, watching as the open circle on the horizon widened further. A shape was rising from it, not like the others. This one was jagged, malformed. Not a memory, but something trapped in one. Something that should have stayed buried. The older woman turned to you. Someone who refused the thread. Someone who cut it. That made no sense. Every girl who cut the thread disappeared. The house never spoke of them again. But what if they didn't vanish? What if the house kept them alive? What if it turned them into something else? You backed away from the edge of your circle, fear rising in your throat. The sky above the broken gate tore open, and from it poured smoke, thick black, filled with the stench of iron and ash. Within the smoke, you saw a figure step forward, and you knew that face. May, only not as she was. Her eyes were pitch black, rimmed in red. Her skin was cracked, threaded with dark lines that pulsed beneath the surface. The same red thread that had once wrapped around your wrist now hung from her fingertips, soaked in something too dark to name. No, you breathed. She was saved. I pulled her out. Isolde didn't look at you. You pulled her body out, but the thread wasn't fully cut. May, or whatever she had become, raised her hand, and the ash beneath her feet scattered outward in waves. Circles collapsed one by one. Women screamed and vanished, their names burning away in the wind. You ran to Isolde, grabbing her wrist. There has to be a way to stop this. There is, she said slowly, her eyes locked on May. But it will cost you. The sky trembled. Everything. You didn't flinch. Tell me. Isolde pointed to the thread, still wound, around your wrist. It glowed faintly, but now it trembled with fear. You hold the original thread, she said. The first one, from the first keeper. It's why you were chosen. Why the house answered you. But if May's gate remains open, the memory will consume everything. All of us. Even the house. You swallowed hard, realization sinking in. So I close it. You become it, Isolde said. You anchor the memory. You thread it into yourself. The house survives, but you won't. You stood silent, the wind howling louder, the field growing darker. The broken gate opened fully now, and May's figure rose higher, surrounded by shadows that didn't walk but slithered, stretching and splitting like pieces of her own soul. Then, for just a second, May's eyes locked onto yours, and she smiled, not as a friend, as something else, a challenge. She raised her hand, and the last circles began to crumble. You turned back to Isolde, your decision made. But before you could speak, a voice rang out behind you. It was hers, the girl from the chapel, the one with your face. Only now, she looked older, stronger. Her eyes glowed. I remember now, she said, and in her hands, a needle, threaded, with something you couldn't see. Isolde gasped. She was the first. You stepped back, stunned. Then what am I? The girl turned to you. You're the last. And before you could ask anything else, the world shattered in red light. The memory had chosen, and the thread was far from finished. The street outside was quiet, too quiet for morning. The sunlight looked real, but somehow you knew it wasn't. It had the warmth of memory, not of day. The sky was soft and hazy, as though painted from someone else's recollection. The cobblestones under your bare feet felt familiar, but not solid. Like the ground could vanish if you thought about it too long. May held your hand, her fingers trembling in yours. She was still pale, still quiet. Her eyes were unfocused, like her body had returned, but her soul was trailing behind, catching up inch by inch. You led her forward gently, past the garden gate, past the corner where Isolde once waited in silence. Everything looked the same, but felt changed. Where are we? May asked. You paused. I think between. She looked at you. Between what? You scanned the street. The buildings were still. The air didn't move. A curtain in a window hung stiff, as though wind had forgotten it. Between memory and release. We're not done yet. May shivered and let go of your hand. She turned slowly to look back at the brothel. From this distance, it looked peaceful, harmless, but you could see the faint shimmer around the edges, like the house was still holding its breath, waiting to see what you would do next. I don't want to go back in, May whispered. You nodded. You don't have to. But you do, she said like she'd known it all along. You didn't argue. You just stepped closer and brushed the pink ribbon still tied around your wrist. It had frayed at the edges, but held strong. The red thread had faded, dulled now that the stitching was done. But it was still there, still warm. You can walk away, you told her gently. The house won't call you again. May hesitated. What if I forget? What if it takes the memories anyway? It can't, you said. Not anymore. They're sewn into the walls now. Into me. Into you. She looked at you with watery eyes. So, it's over? You gave a soft, tired smile. It's only over when we stop remembering. May took a breath and nodded. She turned down the next street, toward the edge of whatever world you were in. As she walked, the sky behind her lightened. The silence began to lift. You could almost hear birds. You watched until she disappeared around a corner. Then you turned back to the house. Its front door stood open now, waiting. You stepped inside, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had ever happened. The hallway was clean. The floors shined. The scent of lavender drifted faintly through the air. You walked through it slowly, past rooms that had once held screams and secrets, past beds that remembered bodies and prayers and silence. You made your way to the attic, your feet guiding you like they'd done this before. The door opened easily. The names were still there, hundreds of them, etched in soft, golden light, no longer carved by suffering, but lit by something gentle. Memory. Recognition. You moved to the far wall. Your name was there. But now, beside it, two more. May. Isolde. You reached out and traced them with your finger. The attic grew warmer. And behind you, the voice returned. Soft. Familiar. You did it. You turned. Isolde stood near the window, bathed in the morning glow. She was younger now. Her eyes were clear. The pain that once weighed down her voice had lifted. But she still had that same presence, calm, knowing, eternal. I thought you were gone, you said. I was, she replied. But so were you. You looked down. Is it finished? For now, she said. Until someone forgets. Until someone silences the truth again. But you've changed the house. It can't feed the same way anymore. It remembers. She walked beside you and looked out over the street. You did more than stitch memories together. You made them visible. You gave the forgotten their names back. I didn't know what I was doing, you admitted. But you did it anyway, Isolde said. And that's what matters. She turned to you with something between pride and sorrow in her eyes. You can leave now if you want. You looked out the attic window. The world outside had begun to move. Trees swayed. Bells rang. The curtains in the windows fluttered. But if I go, you asked quietly, who watches the thread? Isolde smiled. Someone always stays. Not because they're trapped, but because they choose to stay. To remember. To keep. You closed your eyes. And you understood. You didn't need to be afraid anymore. The house was no longer a prison. It was a memory. And you were its voice. When you opened your eyes again, Isolde was gone. But her warmth remained. You walked back down the stairs, each step steady now. The house didn't groan. It didn't creak. It breathed with you. In the parlor, the mirrors still hung above the fireplace. You stepped in front of it, expecting your reflection. But instead, you saw them all. Every woman who had ever lived here. All the names. All the faces. All the threads. And in the center, you. You smiled gently, then stepped back. The mirror returned to normal. You opened the front door one more time. The sky outside was clear. You didn't know what day it was. Didn't know how much time had passed. But the house stood quiet behind you, content. You didn't walk away this time. You simply stepped outside, sat on the front steps, and let the morning come. Somewhere nearby, you heard a child's laughter. The sound of a broom sweeping stone. A door creaking open. The world was remembering itself. And deep inside the house, the thread waited. Not to trap, not to haunt, but to hold. Until the next story began. You sat on the front steps for a long while, your hands resting in your lap, your fingers absently brushing the faded red thread still tied around your wrist. The air was gentler now. It no longer pressed against your chest. It no longer whispered in your ear. Instead, it settled softly, like the weight of a warm shawl across your shoulders. The brothel behind you had changed. Quiet, yes, but not heavy. It felt lived in, like a house with history, not a wound that kept bleeding. Children's voices rang out in the distance, chasing each other around a cart stacked high with cabbages and bread. A woman at the corner stall shouted prices to a passerby. Horses clopped past. The world moved again. You hadn't noticed how still everything had been before, how tightly the silence had gripped this place. But now the threads had been loosened, unwound just enough to let the wind blow through again. And yet something tugged at you. Not from the house, not from the street, from within. You looked down at your wrist. The red thread still pulsed faintly, a rhythm so quiet only you could feel it. Not painful, not urgent, just present, like a reminder, a memory still unfinished. You rose to your feet. There was one last thing to do, one last place you hadn't dared return. You stepped back inside. The brothel welcomed you now. No whispers, no flickering lights, no cold gusts from rooms that had never warmed. Just the creak of familiar wood and the soft scent of lavender and something deeper beneath it, cedar, maybe, or time. You climbed the stairs slowly, brushing your hand along the railing. You passed May's room, your own, Isolde's door, all quiet, all still. At the end of the hallway, the last door stood waiting. The room no one ever entered. The room with no bed, only a mirror, and once long ago a memory. You stepped through the doorway. The mirror still stood. But this time, when you looked into it, you saw only yourself. No shadows, no flickers, no girl who looked like you but wasn't. Just your face, your eyes, your scars, and the thread. For a long time, you stared. And for the first time, you didn't flinch. You didn't look away. You reached into your pocket and pulled out the needle. It still held the tiniest bit of thread, almost invisible now. You stepped toward the mirror and raised the needle, gently pressing its tip to the glass. At first, nothing happened. Then light, a small pulse. The thread unraveled itself, not backward but forward into the glass. And as it moved, the mirror changed. One by one, the names reappeared. Not carved, not etched, written in soft, glowing script across the surface. Ellen, Magda, Isolde, May, Dorcas, you. They shimmered there, alive in the reflection, as though the mirror had always been a window and was only now remembering how to see. You traced your name, and the thread brightened. Then the glass gave way, not breaking, not cracking, just yielding. You stepped forward and walked through. On the other side, you found the memory, not a house, not a place, but a garden, bright with wildflowers, warm with sun. Women sat beneath trees, laughing, sewing, reading, resting. The weight was gone from their shoulders. Some looked young, some ancient, but all of them at peace. One looked up as you stepped in. Ellen. She smiled, stood, and opened her arms. You ran to her. The hug felt like coming home. You remembered us, she whispered. I didn't want to forget, you said. You didn't, she replied. That's why the house changed. Because you chose to carry it instead of bury it. You pulled back, overwhelmed. But I don't understand. What is this place? It's where memory goes when it's no longer afraid, she said. Not heaven, not death, just the truth kept safe. You looked around. The garden stretched endlessly, filled with color and warmth and rest. You saw Isolde beneath a tree, her hands in the dirt, planting seeds beside a little girl with auburn braids. You saw May, walking among tall lavender stalks, her fingers trailing along the petals. She looked up, saw you, and smiled, free now, whole. And then you saw someone else. A woman at the far edge of the garden. Older, strong. She turned, and you saw your mother's eyes. You stepped toward her, heart catching. She didn't speak. She just held out her hand, and in it, your pink ribbon, the one she'd tied in your hair when you were small. You took it gently. Your fingers trembled as you tied it once more around your wrist, next to the faded thread. Together, they pulsed, bright, alive. You looked down at your hands and understood. This was the final thread. Not pain, not fear, but love. The one thread the house had never been able to sever. You stood in the garden for what felt like hours, maybe days. You sat with the women, listened to their stories, sewed circles that never needed to close, laughed, cried, remembered. But eventually, the thread tugged again. Softly, not calling you back, but asking, would you stay or return? You stood in the garden's center. Close your eyes and let your heart answer. When you opened them again, you were on the front steps. The sun was setting now. The town moved around you, slow and golden. A woman passed by with her child, paused, and nodded. Evening, she said, like she'd known you forever. You smiled. Evening. The red thread was gone, but the ribbon remained. And as the sky turned soft with dusk, you knew the house would always remember, because now you did. The wind shifted. You felt it before you heard it. An eerie stillness that wasn't part of the garden, or the town, or even the house. It crept in quietly, like a wrong note in a familiar song. The warmth that had filled the street moments ago vanished, replaced by a chill that curled beneath your skin. You stood slowly, turning your head as a thin shadow stretched across the stones in front of the brothel's door. It was faint at first, flickering like it didn't quite belong. But then it grew longer, stronger, darker. Something was still unfinished. The thread may have faded from your wrist, the ribbon may have softened, but you knew in your bones this wasn't over. You stepped back inside. The house didn't protest. It simply waited, quieter than before, but deeper, like something buried just beneath the floorboards had begun to stir. The parlor was empty. The halls were still. You passed the stairs, passing through shadow, your footsteps slow and careful. Then you heard it, a whisper, not from above, from below. You turned, eyes narrowing. The cellar door. You had never opened it. No one ever had. But now it was wide open. The stone steps spiraled downward, swallowed by a kind of darkness you'd never seen before. Not black, empty, like memory that had been erased. You moved down the stairs, one step at a time, the air growing colder with each breath. The thread on your wrist began to tremble again, alive, warning you, or guiding you. You reached the bottom and found a small stone room, circular and damp. In the center sat a single object, a spindle, wound tight with red thread. Old, ancient, breathing. You stepped closer and realized what it was. The first thread, not yours, not Ellen's. The very first one, the one that began everything. The one sewn into the foundation of the house itself. The one no one was supposed to find. And it was unraveling. The thread curled across the floor in long, tangled lines, slithering toward the edge of the circle. And as you watched, something began to form from the thread. A figure, human-like, but wrong, shaped from memory, too twisted to hold its shape. A mouth, eyes, then none, then too many. And then it spoke, not with words, with thought, with grief, with the pain of every forgotten woman the house had ever consumed. It wasn't a house. It was the origin, the thread keeper before the house had even been built. You stepped back, breath shallow. What do you want? The shape pulsed. The voice filled your chest. Asterisk to finish what I started. Asterisk. The spindle turned. The thread snapped tight. You knew what that meant. If it unraveled completely, the house would collapse. Not just physically. Asterisk through time. Asterisk all the stories would be lost. All the names. All the memories. Forgotten forever. It wanted silence. It fed on silence. And it was hungry again. You clutched your ribbon. The last piece of love, of truth, of voice. It glowed softly, flickering in your palm like a fading heartbeat. You looked down at your hands, scarred, tired, strong. The needle, almost forgotten in your pocket, pulsed warm once more. You had one stitch left, and you knew where to put it. You stepped forward, reached into the tangled red mass, and found the loose end of the first thread. It burned. It screamed. But you didn't flinch. You pierced it with the needle, and threaded it through the ribbon. Your ribbon. The one from your mother. The one you'd carried, buried, nearly forgotten. And as you pulled the thread through, the shape screamed, not with anger but with release. It unraveled from the inside out. Not destroyed, Asterisk set free. Asterisk. The cellar trembled. The spindle cracked. And the thread dissolved, not into ash, but into light. Hundreds of lights, each one carrying a name, a face, a story. They rushed past you, up the stairs, through the walls, into the sky, returning to the world. To be remembered. You collapsed to your knees. The cellar went still. The air warmed. And for the first time in a long time, the house exhaled. When you opened your eyes, you were lying in the parlor. May was beside you, holding your hand. You did it, she whispered. You looked up. The chandelier above swayed gently. The walls were clean. The paintings no longer wept. The house was no longer haunted. It was healed. And as you sat up, the final surprise came. A letter sat on the table. Yellowed paper. Your name written in delicate script. You opened it with shaking hands. Inside, only one sentence. Asterisk, thank you for remembering me. Mother. Asterisk. You gasped. She'd been part of the house too. Not a ghost. A guardian. Waiting for you to see her. You held the letter to your chest, tears falling freely. The house was quiet. Not because it was empty, because it was at peace. And now, so were you. The house no longer whispered. No creaks in the floorboards. No cries behind the walls. No tension hanging in the air like smoke. Only silence, the real kind. The kind that comes after a storm finally breaks. The kind that lets your shoulders drop, lets your lungs fill all the way. You sat on the parlor floor for a long while, the letters still pressed to your chest. It didn't matter how long it had taken. It didn't matter how many lives were stitched into the walls or how deep the thread had run. It was finished now, not erased, not forgotten, just finished. May knelt beside you, resting her head against your shoulder. She hadn't said much since you came back up from the cellar, but she didn't need to. The look in her eyes told you everything. She remembered too. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to know she wasn't a prisoner anymore. Enough to know she wasn't alone. You both sat there for a while, watching the golden light from the windows stretch slowly across the wooden floor. The house glowed now, not with magic, not with haunting, but with presence, like it was alive in a new way. Awake, a witness, finally able to rest. May stirred first. It's strange. You turned to her. What is? She smiled, soft and tired. It's quiet, and I don't want to run from it. You laughed just a little. Me either. You stood together and moved through the house, one room at a time. The old parlor, now warm and open. The reading room where Ellen once sewed beside the fire. The upstairs hallway where your footsteps used to echo in fear. Now they made no sound at all, as if the house was gently cushioning every step, holding you steady. Each door you opened no longer led to shadows, but to sunlit spaces filled with soft air and silence that didn't hurt. May stopped at her old room. The bed had been remade, the curtains washed in soft lilac light. She ran her hand along the doorframe. I don't think I need to sleep here anymore. You nodded. You don't have to. You're free. But I think I will, she said with a smile. Just once. Without fear. She stepped inside, and you didn't follow. This was her return, her closure. You moved on to your own room and paused in the doorway. It was exactly how you left it, but something about it had changed. A small box now sat on the table, one you didn't recognize. Curious, you approached and lifted the lid. Inside, folded neatly, were scraps of cloth. Small ones, each embroidered with a different name. You ran your fingers over the stitches, hand-sewn, careful, full of life. Each one belonged to someone who'd once lived here. Not trophies, not curses, remembrances. Underneath the scraps was one more ribbon, identical to your own, and tied to it, a note written in the same careful script as the letter downstairs. Asterisk, keep this for her. She'll come one day. Asterisk, you didn't know who her was, but somehow you understood. This wasn't the end of the house's story. It was the beginning of someone else's. Someone who would one day find the thread again, as you had. Someone who'd need it. Someone who'd survive because of it. The house wasn't a prison now. It was a keeper, a lighthouse in stormy water. You folded the ribbon gently, tied it around the box, and placed it back on the table. Outside, the wind picked up, but it wasn't cold. It was alive, carrying stories down cobbled streets, whispering names that would no longer be forgotten. You stepped to the window and opened it wide, letting the breeze sweep into the room. Somewhere far off, a bell rang out. Children laughed. Church doors opened. You leaned on the sill and let the day settle in your bones. And then, a knock at the door. Soft. 2 taps. You turned, heart steady but curious. Who will be knocking? You moved down the stairs, passing the familiar paintings on the wall. One of them had changed. Where once it showed a dimly lit figure curled in grief, now it showed 2 women standing side by side beneath a red-ribbon sky. You paused for only a moment, then continued to the door. You opened it. A girl stood there, young, barefoot, eyes wide with wonder, but not fear. She held something in her hand, a needle. You didn't speak. She didn't either. But slowly, gently, she held out her other hand. Wrapped around her fingers, faded pink ribbon. Your breath caught. The one from the box. You stepped aside and nodded. Come in. She smiled, small and grateful, and stepped through the threshold. The house didn't protest. It hummed, barely noticeable, like the beginning of a new song. And just like that, the story began again. Not in sorrow, not in silence, but in the arms of remembrance. Because memory, once set free, always finds its way back. And in this house, now and forever, every thread had a home. She was waiting near the river, Rena said, her voice barely above a whisper. She sat with her feet in the water, holding this cloth. She didn't say much, only that I'd know where to take it when the time came. You stared at the fabric in your hands. It was worn, edges softened by years, but the thread was still firm. The name was there, clear as breath, stitched with the same care your mother had once used to tie ribbons in your hair. You ran your thumb across the thread. A quiet warmth moved through your chest. Not sorrow, not grief. Something fuller, something final. It was a goodbye, but it was also a reminder. She hadn't disappeared. She had simply waited long enough to be remembered properly. You folded the cloth and tucked it close to your heart. Rena stood quietly nearby, watching your face. You knew the weight she carried, the not knowing, the ache of questions that sit under the ribs for years, never spoken aloud. You crossed the attic and placed a hand on her shoulder. She looked up. You brought her back, you said. I didn't even know who she was, Rena admitted. Sometimes, you said softly, we carry pieces of people without realizing it. And sometimes those pieces carry us until we're strong enough to give them a place. She nodded, unsure but comforted. She didn't need to understand everything now, just enough to keep going. Downstairs, the house shifted. It sounds gentle, no longer groaning or stretching like it once did under the burden of forgotten pain. You walked together through the rooms, each one quietly breathing. In the kitchen, fresh air drifted through open windows. A few candles flickered, not because of shadows, but simply because that's what homes do. You could smell something faint, lavender again, or rosemary, or maybe something older. Memory doesn't always come with clarity, but it always brings scent. May sat in the garden when you stepped outside. She looked peaceful, hands resting on her knees, eyes closed, like she was finally able to enjoy the silence. She turned slightly when she heard the steps, then opened her eyes and smiled. Not the hesitant smile of someone waiting to be forgiven, but the calm smile of someone who had forgiven herself. You introduced her to Rena with a simple glance. May understood without needing words. They nodded to each other, and just like that, a new thread was tied, not by history, not by blood, but by recognition. You sat with them as the sun dipped low. The light turned soft orange, bathing the brothel in gold. From a distance, no one would know what had happened inside its walls. But you did, and now so did they. The town around you had begun to change too, not in big, dramatic ways. But you noticed. A woman in the bakery had set out extra loaves for no one in particular. A child had drawn circles in chalk across the cobbled road. A group of women gathered near the chapel, not praying this time, but laughing, full, open laughter that didn't shrink in shame. You realized then what the house had become. Not a tomb, not a trap, but a keeper. A space where memory could exist without being polished or silenced or twisted into shame. You watched Rena gather fallen petals into her palms, tucking them between pages of an old book someone had left behind. May began humming, a sound that somehow blended perfectly with the rustling trees. The sky dimmed further, and soon only candlelight filled the windows. You leaned back, your body finally starting to relax in ways you hadn't realized were still tense. The story had stretched far, across years, lives, names, and threads, but you'd found the center. Not just for yourself, but for those who had carried this weight long before you. Ellen, Isolde, Dorcas, May, your mother, even the women whose names never reached your ears but whose footsteps you had followed. And Rena would carry it forward now, not as a burden, as a choice. She didn't have to stay. You knew that. The house wouldn't hold her. It only opened when it was needed, and only to those ready to see it for what it was. But tonight she stayed, not out of obligation, but out of something gentler, belonging. As the stars blinked to life above the rooftop, you all sat in quiet contentment. No fear of what was behind the door. No ache about what was left undone. Just rest. The story didn't end in a storm or scream, but in peace. It ended in memory held gently, in voices reclaimed, in names spoken aloud, even if only to the wind. It ended with the brothel no longer a secret, but a place of healing, a place of truth. You looked down at the last piece of red thread tied to your wrist. It had faded almost entirely, but that was right. That meant it had been used. It had done its work. What was left now wasn't power or magic, it was understanding. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that sits with you long after the door has closed. You stood, stretched, and turned to the others. I think it's time, you said quietly. Rena smiled. May nodded. You walked together toward the edge of the garden, the soft crunch of gravel under your feet. The house stood behind you, not watching, not waiting, just being. And for the first time in its long, tangled life, it was finally allowed to rest. The wind picked up one last time, curling through your hair like a farewell. You could feel it. The stories were still alive, but they no longer needed to hide. You stepped forward into the quiet of night, heart's light, thread unwound. And the memory, now complete, stayed behind, safe, kept, remembered.